the November webinar for the Blue Trails Guide website. My name is Faye Augustin, and I'm the Associate Director of Colorado River Basin Programs for American Rivers. I'm really glad that all of you are here to join us today as we learn how to give your story a little more punch. A couple of quick things before we dive into the webinar itself. If your connection is lost, please log in again using your unique web link and passcode that was provided to you when you registered with GoToWebinar. And as always, this webinar is being recorded and will be available next Tuesday, November 21st at bluetrailsguide.org/webinars. And one other quick reminder, there is a slight delay between the slides when we move them forward, so please be patient and recognize it's about a 3-second delay. We encourage the asking of questions during these webinar series, so please feel free to submit a question at any time via the questions box on the GoToWebinar side panel of your screen. We'll leave about 5 minutes at the end of the webinar for a question and answer session. So feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar, or you are welcome to hold your questions and ask them at the end of the webinar in the last couple of minutes. Again, by asking your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar side panel. And without further ado, we'll jump right into the meat of the webinar. I'm really excited to introduce my colleague, Sinjin Eberly, Communications Director with American Rivers, who will be presenting to us on how to give your story a little bit more punch. And for many of you, Sinjin is probably not a new voice. He has been and presented on the Blue Trails Guide webinar a few times before this on communication issues. So Sinjin, let's go ahead and pass it off to you.
Gee, thanks, Faye. Surprising that you would introduce me as the meat of the broadcast with that photo sitting there. That's awesome. As Faye said, I'm the Communications Director of American Rivers. I'm responsible for all of our communications and outreach in the Colorado Basin and Northern Rockies, and then I produce and direct most of our films across the country. I'm based in Durango, Colorado. It is a sunny 58-degree day here and perfect and beautiful as usual. And living here lets me enjoy all of the hobbies that I am so enthusiastic about. Writing and photography is easy when you're surrounded by pine trees, and rafting, hiking, mountain biking, and craft cocktails are all things that I enjoy every day. So nice to meet you all. If I've met you before, it's awesome that you joined us again. And I'm trying to make my thing go there. For those of you who've been on one of these before, you know that I'm pretty hung up about thinking about audiences first and foremost, because I believe that we have, we sort of take advantage of our comfort zone with audiences and the target group of people that we want to express our communications to. And so I almost always show this slide just kind of as a pushback to people who say, well, I want my communications messages to resonate with the general public, because of course the general public does exist. There is such a thing, but it isn't a very effective communication strategy to think about trying to get your message out to the general public, because ultimately there's a lot of people out there that you're just never going to reach. So targeting the people that you are more likely to reach is a more thoughtful and more effective strategy. And so if you ask yourself, how big is your herd? You know, if you're a herd of cows and you got one crazy cow in there, and that crazy cow is the one listening to you, that's a good thing. You'll notice this herd is 20 cows, and that's relevant because I have another theory that I try to think about when designing either media or communications and marketing outreach. Basically, and of course, this is not grounded in science. This is grounded in me sitting around thinking about it. But you know, if we own 5% of the people who find rivers important, for instance, whatever your market is, I just assume that 5% of the people naturally fall into your camp. And so in our world, if I assume, okay, 5% of the people who are in the US are really engaged in river conservation or really enthusiastic about rivers, so much so that they pay attention to and participate in the conversation around river protection, clean water, et cetera, those are people that are really easy for us to talk to. But I always try to think about, okay, what about the next 5%? What about the next group of people who engage or recreate in rivers but aren't necessarily involved? So the story I always tell is I'm hanging out in a bar in Durango talking to a journalist, and I point to the bartender and say, I know that that guy on the other side of the bar kayaks in the summer, goes whitewater rafting, maybe rafts the Grand Canyon once every other year or so, snowboards. So he's participating in our advocacy. He's participating in the thing that we enjoy protecting every day. But I also know that he's not a member of any organization, nor does he take action. That's the guy I've got to get to. I've got to figure out how to speak to him in a way that draws him into our camp and taking action on the issues that we care about. And so how you craft the message to be in their terms, right? So the guy on the left is obviously a fisheries biologist. If I'm writing for a fisheries biologist, my language is going to be completely different than if I were writing for a 10-year-old girl who's now 24, by the way, and putting it in her language that she can understand. And that's the first thought challenge, I think, when designing communications is, what is your audience and how do you approach them the best? So enough on audiences. This session is really about adding more punch to your writing. And those of you who have been on one of these before usually see me show this slide as well. There's a real concept that I like to keep in my head, and I don't think I'm the best at it by any means, but how do you infuse fiction-like drama into your, in this case, probably almost always nonfiction writing if you're writing for an organization. So what do I mean by fiction-like drama? I mean drama that pulls you through the story, right? So the two books on the screen are both excellent examples of writers who write with a lot of power and a lot of motion, if you will. The one on the right is called The Water Knife, and it's a little fuzzy because I stole it off the web. But the author's name is Paolo Bacigalupi, and he is a science fiction writer. And The Water Knife is a look at southwestern water 20 or 30 years in the future. So not 2099, but maybe like 2040, 2050. And so anyway, Paolo has a gift of really pulling people through his story. The one on the left, the book on the left is Dead Wake by Erik Larson. That is a nonfiction book, but he writes so powerfully and so well and creates such amazing scenes that it reads like a fiction. You may know, and maybe I've said this before, about 70% of all the books that are sold in the United States are fiction. People like an escape and they like to get away from our lives sometimes, so you read a book. Well, Erik Larson, in this case, Dead Wake is about the sinking of the Lusitania, but it is gripping and it's amazing, and he uses a lot of the things that we'll talk about going forwards. Now, I'm not a paid promoter for the book on the screen called The Writer's Diet by an Australian professor named Helen Sword, but when I stumbled across this book a couple years ago, it basically changed how I think about writing, or at least how I think about editing. And it gives a great number of examples. It's a tiny book. It's probably only like 90 pages. But it's one of the best books that I've found that inspires action-oriented prose. And so basically how this book works, being a little handbook, is it deploys the physical fitness metaphor to drive your writing, right? So if you're If you're someone who wants to become a better athlete, of course you have to work at it, and your ultimate goal is to become more fit than flabby. Well, she deploys the same idea in your writing. If your writing is really flabby, it's going to be kind of lazy, and it's not going to drive ideas, and it's not going to create a lot of action and a lot of inspiration to keep going. It's going to want to kind of sit around. And so the goal, and this is what I really glommed onto in this process, is trying to make my writing more fit than flabby. And as you can tell, I tend to talk in long sentences, and I tend to talk at length. And so making my writing more concise is the challenge for me. So anyway, Professor Sword also developed an online tool where you can test and score the paragraphs of your text. And I'm going to show you an example of that at the very end. It's actually really cool, and it works pretty well. And I have an example in a bit that I'll show you. So hang tight on that. So if we think about making ourselves fit, we think about kettlebells for grammar, because I made that up, and I know you're all giggling. We learned in 8th grade grammar, verbs, nouns, prepositional phrases, adjectives, and adverbs. Those don't change, but let's think about them in terms of the physical fitness metaphor again. Verbs are the things that power our sentences, like muscles propel our bodies, right? So it's the muscles moving and being active, just like in a sentence, just like a verb is in a sentence, and it creates the action that moves those ideas forward. Nouns, then, you can think of as the strong bones of your body, the strong bones of your verbal body, and they convey the meaning and emotion through concrete nouns. So good, strong bones are concrete, and then weak bones are abstract and intangible. And I'm going to have examples of all this stuff to come. So, think about your upper leg being really strong. It moves you forwards when you're running. But don't hit your funny bone, because that's not funny. Prepositional phrases you can think of as the tendons and the ligaments of your prose. It's those interconnecting tissues that are holding together the nouns and verbs. And the warning is, like in your body, tendons and ligaments can be stretched, and they can be torn, and you can overuse them and make them tired, and then your sentences fall apart because those phrases are overused, and they just don't work anymore. So again, we'll have some examples of that to come. And then addiction, adjectives and adverbs are basically like the sugar in the bloodstream. So if you need some fuel, no doubt you need to make yourself have that pep of energy to go out and do your run. You got to have the sugar in the bloodstream. But if you have too much, it both leads to addiction and obesity. And I'll talk about addiction in a little bit, but it's a good way to think about it as I've thought about this for this webinar. So verbs, we're inspiring power and movement. We want to favor strong, specific, robust verbs like scrutinize and dissect, recount, or capture. When I say the word capture, you can probably visualize instantly being confined or being in jail or lassoing a horse, or you're capturing something. And while this isn't a perfect analogy, you compare that to lazy words like have and do and show, and you can see which ones just feel like they have more action. And so the guidance is to basically try to limit your use of be verbs, which are basically is, am, was, were, be, being, or been, because those are all very passive words. I am happy, or I was sad, is much more passive than exhibiting, a more action-oriented terms like, that makes me stoked. Anyway, a couple examples. So here's a one versus one. What is interesting about viruses is that their genetic stock is very meager. Yeah, that's technically fine, probably, but it's pretty boring. How about instead you could say, viruses originate from a surprisingly meager genetic stock. So originate is a much more powerful word than what is that there, and is very, right? Originate is more concrete. A risky thing for me to put in here, pro-life or pro-choice. That is a big question that a lot of Catholics are asked. True, but mushy. Pro-life or pro-choice, many Catholics grapple with this difficult decision. So grapple is obviously more concrete and action-oriented than that is, or that a lot of, just by itself. Another rep of examples, taking the workout analogy here. The passengers were asked to return to their seats. Were asked is super passive. So instead, can you find a way to think about saying something like, the flight attendant asked the passengers to return to their seats. The captain told the passengers to return to their seats. The voice over the loudspeaker ordered the passenger to return to their seats. All of those words are more active than just simply were asked, right? The flight, even though asked is the same word, the flight attendant did something to instruct the passengers rather than it just being passive voice in the initial example. Many people in Russia have no skills in internet usage. These people include the young as well as the older generation, although in the 2016 election, we could argue about that. Many people in Russia, the young as well as older generations, lack internet skills. So much more movement in the end of that one. So on to nouns, the framework for action. Anchor abstract ideas in concrete language and images. Illustrate abstract concepts using real life examples. And so if you've been on one of my webinars in the past, you probably have heard me say, you know, my buddy Brendan always likes to tell me, show, don't tell. Paint the scene, but don't tell them directly what's going on. Now that may sound contradictory. You're wanting to say concrete and have more action-oriented words, but so your goal is to create a create an image that portrays that action in that concrete language, rather than using a bunch of fluffy language to try to paint some picture that isn't very compelling. And then again, limit the use of abstract nouns like sadness or affection, because those are abstract things. They're more conceptual than concrete. So concrete language describes things we can touch, taste, hear, or smell, such as water. We can touch that. Such as hands. We can touch that. The moon. Maybe we can't touch it, but we know it's there. Glass, candle, phone, physical things. So what we're doing then is avoiding words that end in ment, meant, and ion or eon. So confine is better than confinement, and reflect is better than reflection. Reflect and confine are action words. Confinement and reflection are more passive. So structure the phrase to highlight the concrete rather than the abstract. Feeling a sense of, so here's the example, feeling a sense of confinement, Faye was deep in reflection about Henry not allowing her to go for a run outside. Henry's a dog, by the way. On the opposite, on the flip side, it could be said, Henry confined Faye to her house, forcing her to reflect on running outside. So this is obviously one of my examples, not one of Professor Sword's, so it's probably shaky at best, but you know, it's a good opportunity to make fun of Faye on the webinar, as well as give an example of trying to get to concrete language. So these are really long, but this is an application of how this might be used. I'm going to read it just because. So on the left is a obviously much wordier set of phrases than on the right. The capacity of a decision unit to induce innovation implementation within an adoption unit is crucial to organizational success. Risk and complexity are characteristics of innovation that can lead to resistance within organizational adoption units. Are you bored yet? Communications costs, types of power, and communication channels are structured characteristics that can be used by a decision unit, blah, blah, blah. You're already bored. Or you could say organizations thrive on change. However, many employees resist new ideas that they perceive as too risky or complex. Successful managers break down such resistance by communicating with staff clearly and strategically. So I don't know if you were still asleep, but you can see the difference. That's half the number of words, and it's much more action-oriented, and it's much stronger. On to prepositions, connective tissue like in, on, of, to, or about that grabs our nouns and directs the verbs. So these are the things, like I said, that tie it all together. One rule of thumb is avoid using more than 3 prepositional phrases in a row. An example would be in a letter to the author of a book about birds, right? So that's like the way I said it was purposeful as well. Now it's like a horse kind of loping across a field. In a letter to the author of a book about birds. Boring. For example, though, we could take a number of artists, most of them with French connections, but with little else in common than their deep involvement in visual interpretations of literary masterpieces have provided new settings for and few new meanings in Gertrude Stein's often hermetic texts. In one sentence, we could make it better. Many visual and literary artists, some tied to French creatives, have reinterpreted Gertrude Stein's texts in innovative ways. So by pulling out a bunch of the prepositional phrases and reorganizing things just a little bit, we cut it down and make it stronger just right off the bat. Adjectives and adverbs, these are like the sentence syrup, but are sticky and slippery. So this is the fuel in your sentence. If you want to really add some color, this is what you use to do it, but it's way too easy to get sucked into doing this a lot and making all your sentences really just really sticky. So you deploy adjectives and adverbs only when they add new information to a sentence, and you avoid overuse of academic add words, especially ending in able, ac, al, ent. You can see the list here. So an example is it a cat or is it a maniacal cat? Is it a creeping cat or a mysterious cat? What adds to the story? So a choice has to be made if one of those things actually adds to the story that you're trying to tell. And this is where showing the scene rather than telling every detail is really useful. Some examples at the bottom, she walked painfully to the car. So you know in each of these examples on the left, she's walking to the car. Okay, we got that. But she could walk painfully or happily or drunkenly or absent-mindedly to the car, toward the car, or she dragged herself to the car, toward the car. What kind of mental image did you just conjure when you heard she dragged herself toward the car? Or she sauntered toward the car, she stumbled toward the car, or meandered. Each one of those gives you a different mental image. And certainly you could get there by looking at the examples on the left, but it's much easier and much clearer in your mind by thinking about the examples on the right. There's a Facebook page that I follow on the Facebooks called the Writer's Circle. And every now and then the Writer's Circle posts an image of words to use other than, you know, if you need to say she walked, there's obviously walked is what's being done here. So it would be like 30 words that you can use instead of walked, and it might say dragged, sauntered, stumbled, meandered. It's a really handy tool. I usually take pictures of them and keep them in my phone, and then when I'm working on something and I get to one of those words that they have a guide like that, I pull it out, pick a word, keep rolling. Sort of like the webinar. So anyway, lastly, there's waste words, that, there, it, and this. These words are a signal that there's more flabbiness to come. And so, you know, one of the things that I do, especially if I'm editing something, the first thing I do is start looking at every sentence that has the word that in it. And I try to find a way to avoid using that word more than once in any single sentence or 3 times in any paragraph. I tend to write long paragraphs, so it gets tricky if I get sucked in, but it is what it is. So the left and right comparisons, again, there are a number of studies that show that if a cellular phone is being used near a cardiac pacemaker, it causes interference. So there's 3 waste words in that one sentence. Versus, on the right, numerous studies show cellular phones cause interference near cardiac pacemakers. No waste words. It's only action and it's only structure. Or, and then the next one down, there's no reason why you should not use the word there, at least occasionally. Now we're talking about the word there, so this is why it's going to get weird. Indeed, if there were a law passed tomorrow banning all use of the word there, except as a marker of place, there would undoubtedly be protest by professional writers. this is sort of a dumb example, but in a way, it makes sense. There is no reason why you should not use the word there, at least occasionally. Indeed, if a law passed tomorrow banning all use of the word there, except as a marker of place, professional writers would undoubtedly protest. So just by taking out those two theirs that we didn't need and restructuring the second half of the sentence a little bit, it made it a bit more action-oriented. So I mentioned at the beginning the Writer's Diet test. I realized when I put this link in that test.php is kind of weird, but if you can just remember writersdiet.com, it'll show up, and right at the top of the screen it says test. So here's how this works. When you go to the test, you can analyze 100 to 1,000 words, and what it does is it looks into your paragraph and identifies fit or flabby prose, and it points out your score a little bit farther down. So this is an actual paragraph that I just wrote for a magazine article, and this is one paragraph. It's 129 words, and I just literally, all you do is you copy and paste this into the tool and push test, and it works. And so the paragraph and all the different colors that are in the words, that's what the test did, is it picked out all those different words and it categorized them in the little chart below. And so you can see that the results of the test of my paragraph is my verbs are lean, my nouns are lean, my prepositions are fit and trim, my adjectives and adverbs and my waste words are all pretty lean as well. So it's a pretty lean paragraph overall. If it were flabby, you would see these bars increase towards the right, right? So if my verbs, if I had a whole bunch of verbs in there that I didn't need, it might say I need toning, and the bar would extend over into the need toning bucket. And then flabby, and then heart attack. So if it's really, really bad, you will see bars extending over to the heart attack. And then on the far right of the chart, it shows my diagnosis is lean. Now, I actually take that to be maybe too lean, right? So maybe this paragraph is a little bit too lean, and it might be better if I actually added some more color to it through the verbs and the nouns, and then it would say it's fit and trim, which is the goal. So in thinking about this might be more like tofu rather than lean chicken, and there's not a whole lot of excitement in tofu. So I would put a little more time into this paragraph and see if I can make it a little bit flashier, but not too much. And the beauty is you can test this over and over again. So this is the last slide I had. I hope this was helpful. And Faye, I see that it's 11:27, so kick it over.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vivian, for that really helpful webinar on how to make your story more punchy. We've got a few minutes here to answer any questions that folks might have about for St. about the webinar. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have questions that you'd like to ask, you can go ahead and type them in on your question box on the GoToWebinar side panel. Otherwise, we've got a few in the box already, so let's go ahead and get those going. And this, St. is a question about the grade level that you're supposed to be writing for people. So when you're working with, even though you don't believe in the general public, that you're supposed to write towards a grade level that is more focused at the 7th grade reading level. Can you comment on that at all?
Well, yeah. So again, it's based on your audience. If you're and I think we're seeing in modern media now how dumbing down a lot of the media that's being put out into the marketplace really has been, and it's pretty unfortunate. I think 7th grade, 8th grade is probably a good target, and I think within Word there's a tool that scores that. If not, it's an add-on to Word. I've used it before, but I don't use it very often. I will note that in terms of modern media, the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post both write to about the 9th grade level. And, some people are turned off by that. But, 7th grade is probably a pretty good guess, depending on, again, if you're writing for fisheries biologists, theoretically, they're all master's level people. ninth grade is going to be totally fine, and maybe even higher. But I think that's a good thought to be thinking about what is the grade level. It's a good, it's at least a good check on how your writing will be received by a certain audience.
Great, thanks, St. Another question that we've got is regarding kind of where you can use some of the tools and tips that you gave. So is this for the suggestions for more longer pieces, or is it something that you can use, for something that's shorter or quicker, like a blog post or social media, those types of things?
Well, I think it could be, Twitter all the way up to a book. I think for us anyway, a lot of our blog posts are between 600 and 800 words, so a page and a half, and certainly any of it will make your writing more powerful and make it more compelling for people to read it. You certainly see a lot of junk on Twitter, and so think about the opportunity to make your writing even more powerful in 140 or now 280 characters. So identifying what those waste words are, and when you're writing your Twitter posts or even your Facebook posts, taking those out and using the same approach will make those posts more effective as well. Then in your blogs, I think a good way to play with this tool is write your blog post sub 1,000 words and drop it into the writer's diet test and let it score you and see how it is analyzing the places that you might have overlooked. And I think it's it's why I brought the tool up, is it's a handy way to at least get a quick check of how much action could be in your text.
Excellent. Well, being mindful of everybody's time and the fact that it is after 11:30, I did want to go ahead and close out the webinar for today. So we've got a couple questions left on in the question box, which we will follow up with and then have included in our blog that will be available next Tuesday, in November 21st. Thank you so much, St. for taking the time to educate us on how to make our writing more fit and give your story more punch. And thanks to all of you participating online with our webinar series today. We really appreciate your support and encourage you to join us next month. December 12th is the date, I believe, for an intro on wild and scenic rivers. So thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your November and have a happy Thanksgiving. Thanks all.
Thank you, everybody.